My son insulted a woman's perfume at the grocery store, and now we're being evicted from our apartment. My son Felix is 3.5. He's at the age where anything that goes through his head also comes out of his mouth, and we've been working on it. We were at the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, the small one that I've been shopping at for 4 years. I had Felix in the cart seat while I picked out apples. A woman in line behind us at the deli counter was wearing a lot of perfume, the heavy kind that hits you in the throat, and Felix turned around in the cart and said, "Lady, you smell like the inside of a vacuum." I froze. I apologized immediately. I told her he was 3. I told her we were working on manners. I told her I was so sorry. The woman, who I later learned was named Coraline, looked at me like I'd thrown soup at her. She said, "Maybe teach your child basic respect before you bring him in public." I apologized again. I left the apples on the counter, paid for what was already in the cart, and walked Felix to the car. I told him in the parking lot that we don't say things like that out loud, even if we think them. He cried because he could tell I was upset. I felt awful about the whole thing the entire drive home. 3 days later, I got an envelope slid under our apartment door. It was a 30-day notice to vacate. I'd lived in that apartment for 4 years. I'd never been late on rent. I'd renewed my lease 3 months earlier for another year, which meant the notice shouldn't have been legal in the first place. I called the property management company, a small outfit called Linden Holdings, and the woman on the phone told me the owner of the building had given a direct order. She wouldn't tell me why. I pushed. She finally said the owner's name was Coraline. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall for about 10 minutes. Then I called my friend Ruben, who works as a paralegal, and told him what happened. He told me to come over with the lease and the eviction notice. While I was driving over, Coraline called me. She'd gotten my number from the rental application. She said she didn't tolerate that kind of behavior in her buildings, and that she'd already been thinking about renovating the unit anyway, and that this just made the decision easier. I told her my son was 3. I told her I'd apologized. I told her I had a signed lease. She told me she'd had her lawyer look at it, and there were ways around a lease when she needed there to be. She said good luck finding somewhere else with a kid and a single income, and hung up. Ruben read my lease at his dining table while his wife Pilar made coffee. He told me the lease was airtight. The 30-day notice wasn't a legal eviction, it was a bluff. To actually remove me, Coraline would have to file in housing court and prove cause, and "your toddler insulted me at a grocery store" was not cause. He told me to ignore the notice and start documenting every interaction in writing only. He helped me draft a formal response stating I had a valid lease and would not be vacating. He printed it on his letterhead. I dropped it at Linden Holdings the next morning. 2 days later, the maintenance guy from the building, a man named Owen, knocked on my door. Owen had fixed my dishwasher twice and helped me carry a bookshelf upstairs when I moved in. He looked uncomfortable. He told me Coraline had called him personally and told him to stop responding to any maintenance requests from my unit. He said he wasn't going to do that, but he wanted me to know. He also told me something else. Coraline owned 3 buildings on Linden Street, and Owen had been working for her for 11 years. He said in those 11 years, he'd seen her evict 6 other tenants for personal reasons, and that 2 of them had been single mothers. He said one of them had been his cousin. He said if I needed witnesses for anything, he'd be one. Then he gave me his personal cell number and left. Coraline filed in housing court anyway. The hearing was scheduled 6 weeks later. In the meantime, my hot water stopped working. The hallway light outside my unit burned out and didn't get replaced. The package room got locked and I wasn't given the new code. Things kept going wrong, and I really thought it'd be better if I just moved out. I almost opened a rental listing app. I had my thumb on the screen, but then I thought about Owen's cousin and the 2 single mothers Coraline pushed out before me. If I left, I was just the next name on that list. So I called Ruben and told him I wasn't going anywhere. I was going to fight this in court and I was going to win. But first, I needed to build a case that Coraline couldn't talk her way out of. That Saturday morning, I knocked on Owen's door at about 8:30. He opened it in a flannel shirt and sweatpants, coffee already in his hand, and he didn't look surprised to see me. He just nodded and said, "Come in. I figured you'd show up sooner or later." His apartment was small but clean, and he had tools lined up on a shelf by the door like most people have books. He sat me down at his dining table and poured me a cup of coffee without asking. Then he leaned back in his chair and told me everything. He walked me through the whole pattern, year by year, tenant by tenant. The guy in Unit 6 who argued with Coraline over a parking spot and had his heat cut off in December. His own cousin, a single mom with 2 kids, who asked Coraline to fix a broken window in winter and got a notice to vacate 2 weeks later. Another woman on the 3rd floor who complained about a bug problem and suddenly found her rent going up by $400. Every story was the same playbook. Owen looked at me across the table and said, "Every time it's the same. She finds a reason, any reason, and then she makes living there so miserable you leave before the court date. She's never actually won a case because nobody's ever shown up to fight." Nobody had ever shown up. Every single person Coraline had targeted just packed up and left because she made their lives bad enough that leaving felt easier than staying. I realized sitting there at his table that I might be the first person to walk into that courtroom and stand across from her. Then Owen pulled out his phone, scrolled through his messages, and turned the screen toward me. It was a text thread with Coraline's name at the top. One of them, sent about a week after the grocery store thing, said, "Don't fix anything for Unit 4. Let it fall apart. He'll figure it out." There it was, right there on the screen, in her own words. She wasn't even trying to hide it. She just didn't think anyone would ever see it. I photographed every message, making sure the dates, the contact name, and the text were all clear. Owen said she'd sent ones like this before, different units, same idea. He confirmed he'd testify in court. He said he'd been wanting to say something for years, but never had anyone to say it to. That man didn't owe me anything, and he was putting himself on the line because it was the right thing to do. After I left Owen's place, I went back to my apartment and started filming. I turned on the sink faucet and let the camera run while the water stayed cold for 2 full minutes. I filmed the burned out hallway light and the mildew spreading across the ceiling above it. I filmed the locked package room. I wrote everything down in a notebook with dates, times, and whether anything was ever fixed. The answer was always no. I went door to door through the building over the next few days, introducing myself to people I'd only ever nodded at in the hallway. 2 neighbors on the 2nd floor told me Coraline had raised their rent right after they complained about small things. One about a noisy pipe, the other about a broken buzzer. They both said it felt like punishment, but couldn't prove it. A woman at the end of the hall, opened her door halfway, and listened to me talk. When I finished, she said she threatened me. She told me she'd asked for a repair twice, something with her bathroom tile. And after the second request, Coraline called her directly and told her that tenants who cause problems don't last long in her buildings. I asked all three if they'd put it in writing. Every single one said no. They were afraid. I drove over to Ruben's house that evening and spread everything out on his dining table. He went through it piece by piece and said, "This is strong, but it's not complete. You need to show a pattern. If you can get even one other person to submit a written statement, you've got something the judge can't ignore." And on top of all this, I still had to be a dad. I still had to make lunches, do bath time with cold water, read bedtime stories, and keep Felix from noticing that his father was barely holding it together. I picked Felix up from Ruben's house around 7:30. Pilar had given him a bath and put him in his pajamas already, which almost made me tear up because I hadn't asked her to do that. Felix grabbed my hand at the door and looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are we moving?" I crouched down so I was at his level and said, "No, buddy, we're not moving. This is our home." He nodded like that answer was good enough for him, and we walked to the car. I carried him upstairs because he was half asleep by the time we got there. I put him in his toddler bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and stood there watching him breathe for a minute. Then I went to the back of the apartment. I didn't turn on the light. I just stood there in the dark, looking at the fridge. The eviction notice was still pinned there with a magnet. I reached up, pulled it off, and held it in my hands. I read it one more time. Then I folded it neatly, walked over to the counter, and slid it into the file folder with everything else. That notice wasn't a threat anymore. It was evidence. So I went back with Owen's text screenshots, his name blacked out with a marker, and brought them to every door. The woman at the end of the hall opened her door, looked at the printed texts, and her whole face changed. She stepped back and shook her head. "I can't," she said. "She'll come after me too." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I held up the texts and pointed to the line where Coraline told her own maintenance worker to let my apartment fall apart. I said, "The person who sent me these is already willing to testify. He's been watching her do this for 11 years and he's done staying quiet. You don't have to go to court. Just write down what happened to you in your own words. That's it. I'll handle the rest." She stood there holding the edge of the door for a long time. Then she nodded once, said, "Give me a few minutes," and closed it. I waited in the hallway for 20 minutes, leaning against the wall, staring at the mildew stain on the ceiling. When she finally opened the door, she was holding a single piece of notebook paper, front and back, written in blue ink. She described how Coraline had called her directly and told her that if she reported a ceiling leak to the city, her rent would double the following month. She wrote down dates. She wrote down what Coraline said, word for word, as best she could remember. She signed it at the bottom. She handed it to me and said, "Don't let her find out it was me," and closed the door. Meanwhile, Coraline kept escalating. A fake emergency structural inspection notice appeared on my door, printed on company letterhead, telling me to vacate for 72 hours. No inspector name, no permit number, no city seal. Ruben told me it was designed to get me out so she could change the locks. I sent a written response demanding the permit number and the inspector's name. Nobody ever responded because there was no inspection. 2 days before the hearing, I came home from daycare with Felix and put my key in the front entrance lock. It wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. I stood there on the front steps holding my son's hand with my key stuck in a lock that didn't match it anymore. Felix tugged on my hand and said, "Daddy, why aren't we going in?" I said, "The door's being tricky today, buddy. We're gonna wait here for a minute." We waited 20 minutes. Felix sat on the step and poked at a line of ants while I stood there holding his backpack, watching every car that pulled into the lot. He got bored and started asking for a snack. I gave him the crackers from his bag and kept watching. A couple walked by on the sidewalk. Nobody came. Finally, a woman from the third floor came around the corner with grocery bags. She looked at me, looked at Felix, and held the door open without a word. I thanked her and we went inside. I filmed the new lock, emailed the management company with the date, time, and the fact that I'd been locked out with my 3-year-old for 20 minutes, and nobody ever responded. The next morning, I was getting Felix dressed when someone knocked on the door. It was early, maybe 8:15. I opened it and there was a guy in work boots and a company polo carrying a toolbox. He said he was a plumber and that he'd been sent to shut off the water to Unit 4 for pipe repair. I said, "Do you have a work order?" He blinked. "A what?" I said, "A work order. A signed document from the city or from the building owner authorizing this repair. Something on paper that says what the problem is and who approved the work." He said he didn't have one. He said he just got a phone call telling him to come. I kept my voice calm even though everything inside me was screaming. I said, "I'm not authorizing any work without a signed order from the city or from my attorney. You can tell whoever sent you that." He nodded, said okay, and left. I closed the door and leaned against it. My hands were shaking. Felix was sitting on the couch watching cartoons and hadn't even noticed. Owen confirmed later that Coraline had called the plumber from her personal phone after the building's regular contractor refused the job because there was no work order. So she'd gone and found someone else who wouldn't ask questions. That night, I put Felix to bed and read him 2 books. He was almost asleep when he started crying. Real crying. The scared kind. He rolled over and looked at me with wet eyes and said, "Daddy, is the mean lady going to take our house?" He was 3.5 years old and he was lying in bed worrying about losing his home. I picked him up and held him against my chest. His whole body fit in my arms with room to spare. I said, "Nobody is taking our house. I promise you that." He buried his face in my shoulder until his breathing got steady. I rocked him for a while, not because he needed it, but because I did. Then I laid him back down and watched him fall asleep, his hand curled around the ear of his stuffed rabbit. After that, I wasn't hopeful anymore. I was focused. Coraline was scaring my kid, and my 3-year-old was having nightmares about a woman he'd spoken 1 sentence to at a grocery store. That changed everything. Ruben and I spent the next 2 days preparing for the hearing. We organized every piece of evidence, printed 3 copies, and rehearsed what I'd say. Owen confirmed he'd be there. The neighbor's letter was notarized. The night before, I dropped Felix at Ruben and Pilar's house. Pilar opened the door before I even knocked. Felix wrapped his little arms around my neck and said, "Good luck, Daddy." 4 words that landed harder than anything Coraline had said or done in 2 months. I drove home to an apartment that was quiet in a way it only gets when Felix isn't there. No cartoons, no little feet on the floor, no random questions about why the sky is blue or where birds sleep, just silence. I sat down at the dining table and spread every piece of evidence in front front of me. Owen's text with Coraline's name right there at the top, her own words telling him to let my apartment fall apart. The neighbor's handwritten letter, the fake inspection notice with no permit number and no city seal. My photos and videos, the cold water, the dead hallway light, the locked package room, the new lock on the front entrance, the timeline Ruben and I had put together, every retaliatory action in order with dates. 3 copies of everything, organized and ready. This was the most organized, most careful thing I had ever done in my life, and I'd done it all while taking care of a 3-year-old by myself in an apartment with no hot water. Then my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You should have just moved. Now you'll wish you had. I took a screenshot, printed it, and added it to the back of the file. The last thing the judge would see. I closed the folder, set it by the door, and went to bed. I woke up the morning of the hearing and put on the only button-down shirt I owned. Ruben met me in the lobby. Owen was already on a bench outside the courtroom. The room was smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lights, a long table for each party, and a judge's bench at the front. Coraline walked in wearing a dark blazer and heels, her lawyer behind her in a gray suit. She sat down and never looked at me once. Her lawyer presented first. He said this was a standard landlord-tenant dispute. He said his client had received multiple complaints about disruptive behavior, and that the eviction was issued as a last resort after repeated warnings had gone unaddressed. None of that was true. Not a single word. I wanted to stand up right there and say so, but I didn't. Ruben squeezed my arm under the table, firm, like he was saying, "Not yet." The judge asked me to present. I stood up. My legs felt a little unsteady for the first second, but then I started talking, and everything else went away. I walked him through the whole thing from the beginning. I told him about the grocery store, about Felix saying what he said, about me apologizing right there in the deli line. I told him about the 30-day notice that showed up 3 days later. I told him about calling the property management company and finding out Coraline was the building owner. I told him about the phone call where she mocked my income and said good luck finding somewhere else with a kid and a single paycheck. I told him about the maintenance being cut off, the hot water that stopped working, the hallway light that went dead and never got replaced. I told him about the fake inspection notice with no permit number and no city seal, the lock change that left me and my 3-year-old outside for 20 minutes, and the plumber sent to shut off my water the morning before this hearing. I handed each piece of evidence to the judge one at a time and waited while he read it. Coraline's lawyer objected twice. The judge overruled him both times. Then Owen stood up. He walked to the front of the room slowly, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for a long time. He confirmed who he was, how long he'd worked for Coraline, and what his job was. Then the judge asked him about the text messages. Owen nodded and said, "I've worked for her for 11 years. She told me not to fix anything in his apartment. She's done this before." His voice was steady and plain. No drama, just facts. He confirmed the screenshots I'd submitted were real. And then he went further. He named 2 former tenants by unit number, not by name, and described how Coraline had done the same thing to them. One in Unit 6, one in Unit 2. Same playbook every time. Find a reason, cut off services, make life miserable, wait for them to leave. When Owen finished, Coraline's lawyer presented 3 printed complaint letters about noise from my unit. The judge asked for dates and signatures. 2 had no signatures at all. The 3rd was signed with a name that didn't match any current tenant. The judge set them down with an expression that made it clear he'd seen enough. Ruben submitted the neighbor's notarized letter and Owen's text screenshots for the record. The judge read them slowly, then he turned to Coraline. He asked if she had instructed Owen to stop servicing my unit. She said, "I manage several buildings. I don't remember every conversation." He asked if she had personally filed the 30-day notice. She said yes. He asked what the cause was. The room went still. Her own lawyer was watching her, hoping she'd say something about lease terms or property management or anything that sounded like a legal reason. Instead, she sat up straighter and said, "His son was rude to me in a public place. He has no control over that child. Honestly, someone like him shouldn't even be raising a kid alone." The room went dead quiet. I mean, completely silent. Even the court clerk stopped typing. I could hear the air coming through the vent above us. My hands started shaking under the table. I pressed them flat against my legs to keep them still. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She'd just told a judge, in a courtroom, on the record, that she tried to evict a tenant because a 3-year-old said something she didn't like at a grocery store. And then she attacked me as a father while she was at it. The judge's expression changed. The patient, neutral look was gone. His mouth was set in a hard line and he was looking at Coraline like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he spoke. He said the eviction was denied. The 30-day notice was voided. He stated on the record that the evidence strongly suggests a pattern of retaliatory conduct by the building owner and referred the case to the city's tenant protection office for further investigation. He told Coraline that any further retaliatory actions against any tenant in any of her buildings would result in fines and potential loss of her rental license across all 3 properties. Her lawyer started to speak. The judge cut him off. "We're done here." Owen was waiting in the hallway. He stuck his hand out and I shook it and he held on for an extra second. Ruben came out behind me and clapped me on the back hard enough that I stumbled forward. He was grinning. He said, "You did it, man. You actually did it." I thanked them both, got in my car, and drove straight to Ruben and Pilar's house with the windows down and the radio off. Pilar opened the door and I heard little footsteps coming fast across the hardwood behind her. Felix came around the corner at full speed, stuffed rabbit in one hand, and ran right into my legs. He looked up at me and said, "Are we going home, Daddy?" I picked him up, walked to the car, and buckled him into his seat. The drive back took 11 minutes. I parked in the lot, carried him upstairs, and unlocked the door with the same key that hadn't worked 2 days ago. Someone had fixed it. I set Felix down, and he walked to his room without being told. I hung my keys on the hook by the door and stood there for a second, looking at nothing. Then I started making dinner.